Hello, welcome to today's discussion on marketing expense from an OEM perspective and how it all works.
Let's jump into it.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. Please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Mark, I think to kick today's discussion off, can you explain exactly how marketing works in a car company and the difference between fixed marketing expenses and variable marketing expenses?
Yes, John, it's interesting when we think of marketing, we've had a number of marketers on the show which have just purely focused on the marketing side of things. But when you look at the traditional model of an OEM, when you distribute through a dealer network, there is a phrase that's used in many OEMs, which is total cost of distribution. Now, total cost of distribution is not only the cost to get the vehicle to the dealer and then sell it to the customer, but it's that whole cost of getting the purchase intention, consideration, the incentives around the execution of the sale. So all that is taken into account as to the total cost of, if the retail price of the car is this, what did it cost me if I'm the car company to sell that car through this franchise dealer model? So that's why we look at the total cost of distribution. Now, we've often talked about the logistics side, that's one cost. But when we look at the actual cost of distributing through a dealer, and this is why it's a good question to look at the agency model and why the agency model is revisiting this, is this cost of distribution. So when we look at the numbers, and we'll just use round figures, many an OEM, the number when you look at, and many an overseas head office would say, what is your total cost of distribution for the product? And you can draw a circle around 30%. So if the price of a vehicle is, say, $100,000, the total cost of distribution for that vehicle in the main would be 30% or $30,000. You might say, well, okay, how's that? What makes up those components? This is just round figures. Some will be less than 30, some will be more. So when you look at the total cost of distribution, it's made up of 3 things. The first one is fixed marketing expense. What does it cost to advertise? And these are all the traditional above-the-line elements. So advertising, sponsorships, TV, digital, radio, outdoor, and other advertising activity that is a bunch of money that you spend, might be product launch, activations, all these sorts of things. Those are fixed expenses. So you spend your money and there's no guarantee of selling one car. But what that is a fixed expense that you've spent it, money's gone. So you sell one car or 1,000 cars, that is a fixed expense. So fixed spend. And that's often one that tends to get cut the first when volumes don't meet the expectations of target. So you look at what's your fixed marketing expense. And that one averages, let's draw a circle around, say, 10% for a launch brand. The more volume you do as a percentage of the throughput, it's a lower cost because you get synergy out of having more volume and hopefully your marketing is efficient and you get less than 10%. So it starts dropping down. The next one is your variable marketing expense. So the variable marketing expense is a very complex one. And these are the levers that the marketing director usually plays with the fixed marketing expense. And the variable marketing expense is the domain of the sales team. So the sales team have a number of elements that make up that variable marketing expense. And what variable by nature means that as you sell one car, the expense is attached to a per unit item. So the more you sell, the more you are spending. But if you don't sell, you don't spend as much versus fixed expense. So you might have a large figure per car. If you say it had $10,000 as variable expense, and you sold 2 cars, it's $20,000. But if you have a fixed marketing expense and you spend $2 million and you sell 2 cars, well, it's $2 million, right? You sell 4 cars, it's $2 million. You sell 4 cars for $10,000, that's $40,000 variable expense. So that's how the variable side of it works. Then you have the final one, which is the big one, is dealer margin. So the dealers, from when an OEM works out the numbers, the OEM says, okay, the dealer's going to have this as the dealer margin. Now, dealers may choose to discount that margin. Right now, the unusual circumstances around COVID is no discounting or very little discounting. So that margin is an expense. So the OEM would have worked out, okay, this is the price of the vehicle, recommended retail, there's a dealer margin, there's a fixed marketing expense, and there's a variable marketing expense. That's my total cost of distribution. So that's why the OEMs are looking at, well, how can we improve our profitability selling vehicles to the customer? Now, we don't sell traditionally directly to the customer, but the new business models are that, yes, they do. So then you reduce the dealer margin and you increase the margin the OEM makes because you're paying the dealer an agency fee. So what happens in the VMA, or the variable market expense, which is the very complicated one, is you've got things like target achievement. So everyone has a target to achieve. The car company has a target. The sales company has a target. The dealer gets given a target. In order for the dealer to be motivated to achieve that target, in many instances, there's a target achievement allowance. And that might be up to 2.5%, depending on what the structure of those allowances are. You get your target, month, your quarter, annual. So it all adds up. It's this cumulative effect. So if a deal is performing well, they can actually make some very good money out of the targeted bonuses, etc. Then you've got another element as far as the VME is concerned, which is the baseline variable costs of when you need to have demonstrators, they need to give you some money as a demonstrator allowance, or courtesy cars, we need to give you money towards your courtesy cars to help assist with the depreciation on those vehicles, and the running costs as well. You then have other incentives such as trips, incentives for sales consultants, incentives for sales managers, dealers going on overseas trips if they achieve certain criteria, etc., and other engagement programs along the way. So they all add up. And also customer satisfaction is a big element, and there's often an incentive, and it's often up to around that 1% of the cost of the vehicle goes towards the dealer for providing a good customer experience and good follow-up and good service. So customer satisfaction has an element of incentive as well. And there are often other qualitative standards that if you meet those qualitative standards, there's some variable marketing expense associated with those too. So all of these elements are baseline that enhance behaviours and drive performance. But then there's the incentives that help the customer, which are the retail campaigns. And those retail campaigns may be something as simple as a finance campaign with a subvented finance rate. It could be a dollars per week program. It could be 3 years free servicing, 5 years free servicing. All that has to be paid by someone. So that gets paid out of the sales allowance. So these incentives might just simply be a retail bonus. Here's some cash back, or here's some money on the bonnet of the car to help clear it for the month, etc. So all those incentives add up to be variable marketing expenses. That's the complex nature of all the three elements in the total cost of distribution. So you can see there are many levers at play when you see a vehicle being advertised. There's a whole heap of workings going on behind the scenes, and these things are measured on a monthly basis. So they're budgeted for on an annual basis. They're assessed on a monthly basis through a PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act process. So you can see, are we exceeding our fixed marketing expense? Are we achieving our volume targets? Are we exceeding our variable marketing expenses because we allowed for X amount of, say, demonstrators, or X amount of service loaners, or we thought we'd sell this mix of finance sales versus the actual. And you can work out whether you're out of pocket or you actually have a bit of buffer left in the tank. So all this happens on a very detailed and assessed process. So there's a lot happening behind the scenes with total cost of ownership.
I think, Mark, is quite a fascinating part of a car business. I think what's important to emphasize that it's very strictly controlled by the finance team and also from the parent company. So there's very few circumstances where you can transfer money from your fixed marketing expenses to your variable marketing expenses or vice versa. So that's never allowed. But if you spend more, say, on demonstrators or service loaners or you run incentives, that money has to be found somewhere else in that pot of money for variable marketing expenses. There's nowhere else. So if you increase one part of it, so if you do a big retail campaign, you have to recover that money elsewhere. And I think there's often confusion because a lot of dealers say, oh, you need to spend more advertising on marketing, or you need to do more retail campaigns or whatever. If you do that, you have to find that money from somewhere else in that pot of money. So you have to maybe do away with a dealer trip, or you have to do something else. And that's a very important point to remember.
Oh, absolutely, John. I think we've all lived that at some point where you've overcooked the volume on a particular model because you don't put the same variable marketing expense on each model. Some vehicles need more incentives than others. Some attract more fixed marketing expense than others. So you might be strong with advertising one particular model, but you'll need to put incentives on another to help clear it or help move it along. Sometimes you have to do both on a vehicle, which means others get nothing. So you've got that fixed pot, and it is very much a balancing act, and you're juggling where the money lives. And you might have overspent in one month, which means the following month, just to remain on budget, you've got to cut back on your spend. And often you'll get feedback from, say, the dealer network, say, well, why have you cut the bonus on this car? Keep giving us more money. It's like, well, it's not a bottomless pit, not an endless bucket of funds. There is a finite amount of money, as you say, John, and you've got to balance the books along the way. And often it doesn't necessarily match what the market's doing. So if you've got competitors that are suddenly splashing more money or spending more above the line with advertising, you need to then do more from an incentive perspective and get your message out there. The hardest thing with a retail campaign is getting the message out in a timely enough fashion for it to actually move the dial to get a call to action to quickly transact. And that's one of the challenges. And that's something that will wash out with when we get back to a normal market where supply equals demand and we get to an oversupply again. It'll be interesting to see what actually happens from a order and retail sale perspective. Because we talked about in a previous podcast, pre-reporting. If you don't report those numbers, the first thing that gets cut is your fixed marketing. And the next thing will be cut is the variable marketing. So you want to protect that fixed marketing so you can keep the brand story going, because there's a whole process involved in continuing that brand. If you get the fixed marketing right, the product's right, the storytelling's right, the competitive marketplace enables you with your product and what it is to achieve your targeted share and maybe more, you then can dial back on some of the variable marketing expense. So these are the levers, and this is the market at its, with all the forces at work externally and internally, juggling to try to get all of this stuff balanced. And it is very much a juggling act, which is why most people in the industry, after they've been in it for 2 or 3 years in senior levels, have very grey hair.
Mark, you make a very good point about the cutting that fixed marketing expense, because a very important point to explain about it is at the beginning of the year, often you have to set up a whole marketing plan for the whole year for your parent company, and you have everything set out by quarter. And you can't put all your spend in the first quarter, because what they'll do is, depending on how your volume is going, they'll release each quarter. So, okay, well, you can go ahead and start spending on the money for the next quarter. But if you're not achieving your volumes at the end of the first quarter, they're already starting to say, okay, well, you need to cut 20% out of your next quarter, and you can only spend that amount. So that's how it works. So that's why you often find towards the end of a financial year, especially into the last quarter, people are, the dealers are getting frustrated because you're not marketing as much or advertising as much, but you're having to rein in this expenditure to meet your budget requirements.
Absolutely. It is very much a challenge as far as the money being allowed. I think you raise a very good point that it's not, very few MDs and sales companies have control over their finances. They have to answer to an overseas master who micromanage all of the figures and micromanage and measure the performance. So if the volume and profit is not lining up with what the budget said, then expenses get reviewed first, and fixed marketing is the first one to go. Another one that we didn't mention is what we call G&A, the general administration costs. So basically that's the employees. It's the cars that people drive around in, all the various administrative costs around, the building that you're leasing, the photocopy and all that sort of stuff, all those G&A expenses, the phones, the fuel, the works, that's all, and the cost of running the business with its staff. So, from a longer term, when things start tightening up, well, that's when you start looking at, well, okay, how can we cut back on G&A? What do we need to do? Or if things are going well, it's like, well, okay, we let's expand, because our G&A as a percentage is quite low. keeping under say 2 or 3% is nice, and then you can set up yourself for success. And that's the beauty of when a brand is growing, you're always adding. If a brand's going through a tough time, you're contracting. So they're the 3 areas that you look at. But this is where the total cost of distribution comes into play with that dealer margin and with agency. Because if you are controlling the price as the OEM, you've set the price versus the market. So you know what that product, you want to bring it to market at price X. So you then dial back on what the margin you're giving to the dealer. So that's a little bit more for the OEM to have up their sleeve. And they can then either put incentives on that internally so they can adjust the price, or it just means that they can recover some of the costs. And the main reason for it is that obviously EVs, there's less margin in the vehicles because there's been a lot of engineering that has to be amortized over the next 10 years at least. So, and there's, the costs of batteries and the like are still quite expensive. So there is not the margin in an EV that there was, say, in an internal combustion vehicle. So these are the elements as to why there is the change and why there is a need for change from a macro perspective with these car companies. Thank you for listening. Hopefully the brief overview of fixed marketing, variable marketing, and dealer margin comes into play from a total cost of distribution. It is very much a tricky science to balance and to get right.
Subscribe to our channel on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify, and we'll talk to you again next week.